Today, I'm joined by Emmy-nominated DP James Whitaker, ASC, whose work turns suburban stillness into something eerie, intimate, and quietly destabilizing. James, it's so great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Robert. I'm super happy to be here. This is great.
So let's talk about how this show lives in ordinary suburban spaces. And you've said you were initially kind of concerned about how to make that visually interesting. So where did you land? What became a visual hook for you in episode one?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that's mostly because Steve and I had done a couple of other shows, Patriot and Perpetual Grace Limited, that offered up natural, beautiful landscapes. For example, Patriot had European looks in Paris and Luxembourg and Prague. And Perpetual Grace had, it was like a natural Western. We shot it outside of Santa Fe. And so it had all these beautiful desert landscapes. And yeah, so it was like, how are we going to bring something visually interesting to more of a, not mundane, but more of like an ordinary setting, which is something that I grew up with. Like I was a suburban kid, so I'm very familiar with those backgrounds, parks and houses and backyards, and how do you make those visually interesting? So we started, kicking around ideas, and really I came just one day, it sort of dawned on me, what if all the most amazing street photographers in the world sort of landed in this neighborhood and could capture, just from like an observatory sort of observational point of view, what's happening in these neighborhoods. And so that to me led to something Steve and I were already quite familiar with the way we photograph our other shows, which is working on very beautiful graphic wide shots, making the most of the space within a frame that you can, which often leaves characters to be very small within a frame. You make them feel isolated within a frame. And then very, very, very tight close-ups that can very much isolate them in their own particular moments, more through portraiture. And and so we chose to shoot on a large format camera called the Alexa 265, which is brand new. I think we're the first show that shot the show from start to finish with that camera. Yeah.
Wow.
And and we use these beautiful vintage lenses that are called prime DNAs that have a lot of found elements from old stills glass from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and they're rehoused into these beautiful combinations of glass that make sort of the portraiture really sing, because a lot of them have very, very beautiful center sharpness, but then the edges fall out of focus, which really makes for this portraiture and isolating idea.
Yeah. We're going to unpack so many. It does. We're going to unpack so many of the things that you've just said. So let me try to start from the beginning. So firstly, there's a real tonal tightrope in the pilot, because there's comedy, discomfort, and ultimately this darker vibe. They're all coexisting in the same scenes. And so how do you calibrate a camera approach that doesn't tip too far into one or the other?
I think it's a little tricky, and you're right. We were doing that dance on a daily basis, actually on a scene by scene basis, because you want the photography to be honest. You don't want it to. Steve and I talk about the comedy of the shows that he writes so beautifully, and that is that we never want to tip the hat that we're trying to make something feel funny. We want it to feel honest and dramatic and have tension even within the comedy, and then just let the comedy play out. But it's definitely a tightrope, because we're looking at this relationship between a very, very honest, pure human being and Floyd that is at a moment in his life, middle age, where he's feeling like not everything's perfect in his home life, and for whatever reason, he's lucky enough to meet a new friend, and that's Jason's character, right, Clark, who's our weatherman, and Clark's lucky enough to meet him as well. And they form this beautiful new friendship. But like happens with all sort of friendships, that can come with some swaying, right? And so when Clark makes an offer to, let's check out this app called DTF St. Louis, that takes Floyd down a darker part of his life. And so there are these sort of funny over the top moments between these guys as they develop their friendship, and it's really warm, and we're finding them develop their friendship, which is beautiful. And warm and they hug each other and they are really honest with each other. And that's sort of a new way to look at masculinity. I feel like Steve was kind of, trying to make a comment about, in a way that men can be as open with each other as women can be. And I thought it was so beautiful. And then, yeah, we have these comedic moments, and then we get into the, after Floyd's character dies, then we get into the investigation, which becomes photographically much different for us. We tried to
Yeah.
play the friendship bit of it more loose, handheld, warmer tones, and the investigative portion of it, more formal framings, oftentimes trying to isolate Clark as he's getting grilled by these two police
Yeah.
officers, and cooler tones. So, yeah, that's kind of how we positioned it all.
The anxiety inducing foyer interrogation scenes between Bateman and Jenkins are so like controlled. The blocking is rigid. As you say, the palette is colder. And so was that always the design from the beginning? Like how did you go about building that tension visually, and what were the key rules that you set for those scenes?
Well, I think, the first time they go to the police station, right? Clark and Richard Jenkins's character, our Homer, are in this sort of lobby area because it's an informal investigation. He just invites him down to this, sheriff's office, and they have a conversation. And this sort of Laura Fox, our production designer, built this sort of amazing brutalist set
Yeah,
almost.
it's so brutalist and
And
blocky and
yeah,
very
yeah,
imposing. Yeah.
yeah. It's a lot of vertical, and it's a space clearly, that Jenkins, Homer's character, obviously knows is going to make you feel uncomfortable, even though it's not in that formal investigation sort of interrogation space. But then also, Laura designed this sort of slatted wall. It feels like it's, open to another atrium behind it. And maybe for us, that allowed us to create a sunlight source that starts maybe a million miles away or however far the sun is away, but drives through perhaps an open atrium window and then drives through the slatted wall into the space to find our characters. It sort of feels like an investigation. But also, I love that we made the choice on the day to put Jason and his background, those slatted walls. It almost looks like prison bar cells, like he's, heading that direction.
Yeah, yeah. It really, really struck me. It's such a contrast to obviously the more suburban scenes that we were talking about earlier. And on that note, you did mention that often the photography on this show is observational, intentionally passive, like we're watching life unfold, but kind of in a voyeuristic way. So, what's a really good example of what you're actually doing differently on set to achieve that aesthetic?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to think of a specific scene, for example, but yeah, I mean, even the very first, for example, the very first scene when um, Clark and Linda show up at, sorry, Floyd and Linda show up at Clark's house. Sorry, let me start over again. That very first scene when Floyd and Linda show up at Clark's house and they sort of go to the backyard and they're having a barbecue. The camera is inside of sort of a screened in porch area, and we're looking out past sort of the edge of a screen, and we're looking at Richard, which is their son, throw rocks toward the house and hit the house, right? So that feels very observational.
Mhm.
And this was a great Steve moment. We actually talked about the shot several times because we wanted to have Richard throwing rocks at the house, wanted to feel like it was observational, like we're just observing him do this, and then have Floyd walk into the frame and be, what are you doing? Why would you do that? Why would you throw rocks at his house? And, let's think of something else to do. And then Steve in his brilliance goes, God, wouldn't it be great if all of a sudden Clark comes swinging in the side of the frame, and starts talking to him. Hey, can I get a little help? And
Yeah.
I need to move the swing set. So that was one way. And then, the swing set thing was quite interesting because, as those two guys find that's kind of their first meeting place where they discuss the DTF app on the first time. And it's very calm. There's not a lot of stuff going on. But we've discovered that Jason, in his Clark in his perverse kind of way, has gotten Floyd to help him move the swing set closer to the edge of the lawn so that he, when he's got his alone time later, can swing high enough so that he can see this young lady next door who lives next door. And those points of view from over the girl to Clark swinging over the fence are very sort of observational. And um, that sort of mix between us watching that happen in wide shots, but then also mounting cameras directly on the swing that would be
Yeah.
with Clark as he's swinging. Um, that our brilliant grip department, key grip, Kurt Cornerman helped me devise, was very powerful connectivity.
Yeah. I can imagine. And you know what else is really cool? Like you mentioned this earlier, so let's dive in a bit more in terms of the close-ups because there's a subtle shift across the series where that observational style kind of suddenly tightens and the camera becomes more controlled in moments of like pressure or intimacy. And so I just wonder when you've decided to break that passive approach and start imposing something more deliberate on the frame, what does actually proximity do or give you emotionally that maybe a wider, more observational or contextual frame wouldn't?
Great question. I mean, I think each has their own power, right? Because, for example, there's a beautiful scene that happens in a later episode where Clark and Floyd are standing in the middle of a living room and there's a big window in Floyd's house. And these guys, we're just on a huge wide shot of this room and these guys hug in that shot. And that alone has this, and they're silhouetted against the window. That alone has its own power. But it felt like, for example, that could be cheating the situation. So for sure, we wanted to see the emotion and the importance, and you know, getting in there and close-ups is ultimately very important in those moments. Now, the size of the close-up is something Steve and I are very, very sensitive about. Like, are we here or are we here? The difference in those two things is
Yeah,
massive. Not only because of the size of the frame, but also what happens to the background as it falls out of focus. Because the tighter you are, sometimes the softer you can get the background to go, or you can just be sharp on just eyes only and ears fall out of focus. And, Steve and I for a long time have found that at a minimum, a scene works with just one wide and a couple of tights, or even just one tight if you want to just hear one part of the conversation and not the other.
wow.
So yeah, I think it goes scene to scene for sure, and then you make these choices about handheld. Like I said before, that kind of became a rule when those guys were in flashback mode pre Floyd dying. Right, we would
Yeah,
99% of the time be handheld, very subtle handheld, not walking around like some sort of action movie or something like that, but
yeah,
very
yeah,
controlled handheld, like almost as still as you possibly can be handheld. But we would break rules, and that's one of the beautiful things about working with Steve is that we break rules constantly that we make, and sometimes we'll just be like, let's just go into a dolly and just be as static as we can be for a quiet moment like this.
wow. But then, what are you thinking about emotionally when, like, when you're looking at like spatially or compositionally? What are you thinking about when you're putting two people in a frame in a certain way, how they sit in the frame, how apart they are? Is that something that is very intentional every time, or do you just kind of see what's going to land depending on what the scene requires?
I think that's the case more than not, especially with Steve now, because we have so many years working together. Is we will talk about a scene, say in prep, but it really comes down to how is this going to block and how are the characters shaped going to block. For example, there's a scene with another swing set where Clark and Floyd are on a swing set at a different location. And we talked a lot about the fact that we wanted these two characters almost facing each other like this so that we would get great overs and great dirty overs. But the wides in that space felt so great. And what I love about Steve and how he uses the wides, it's not like traditionally we think his wide shots are often just establishing shots. But
Yeah,
Steve will often editorially start on the close-ups and we'll be in the story and not really know where we are. We might be like, 3 minutes into a scene and we're still in close-ups. And then all of a sudden they'll cut wide and you'll go, oh, wow, we're in this neighborhood. We're in this suburban neighborhood. And this kind of thing happens in these neighborhoods. And then you cut back in. And I think it's a really beautiful
yeah,
way to use those wides. But I think, we're always photographically looking for what makes sense graphically, what brings interest to the frame. Um, where in the frame can we put people, in that particular example, can we put them in the bottom left corner of the frame and that becomes a ton of negative space around them and that feels
Yeah.
somehow uncomfortable or odd, and I think that was something we were going for as well. And certainly I was going for it. And that was that, this, the nature of the show, the nature of the murder, the nature of the investigation, the nature of it feeling ordinary, but not being at all, made me want to photograph these locations in ways that made you feel a little bit off as a viewer. And
Yeah.
that was a heck of a lot of fun for me.
I can imagine. I'm pretty sure there's a scene in the diner where they're at the table, but they're right in the center of the frame, and the diner just feels like a cavern. And it really struck me. I'm like, okay, I kind of think I know where you're going with this, but it really does help. It helps the mood, it helps the vibe, it helps us understand what's going on in the story. But what about this? What about I guess you could call them overhead compositions. You use them at very specific moments, and I actually always really love those as a big film nerd. But what are you looking for emotionally when you go there? Is that about like detachment or something else you can only unlock from that vantage point?
Yeah, I think there is something that feels sort of, I don't know, to observe something from straight overhead, looking straight down is very unsettling because it's a point of view we don't get in real life.
Yeah,
It's very rare that we can have a point of view like that, especially looking straight down. If you're slightly off angle, you might get that view at, I don't know, the Eiffel Tower or something like that. But to look
yeah,
straight down, you might only get that, some glass floor on the Sears Tower or, you know, some glass overlook in the Grand Canyon or something like that.
mm,
So it's
yeah.
unsettling. And I think it can make you feel a little um,
I love that.
ungrounded. And,
Yes.
it's whenever we talk about those shots, it's always a conversation because they're expensive to pull off, whether or
Uh,
not for us, we don't tend to like to do them from drones because even drones can get a little bit of drift.
yeah.
And, or you don't know on the day you might have a little bit of wind that might make you do it. So we like to do it from very, very tall machines, like 135-foot condors. For example, in the stadium where Linda's character and Jason's character go to watch the baseball game and she says, snag it, the beer between her legs.
Oh
We
God.
had 135-foot condor there getting very wide lens observational straight down shots of the stands, and it certainly takes you, it's like, where am I?
Yeah.
It's something that's unusual.
It is. It's and disconcerting. Everything I watch these days, I'm like, is that a drone? Is that a crane? What's going on? Like, it's just so fascinating that you're able to create these shots. So, okay, so there's a few sex scenes in this show, right? And they are, let's just say, unusual. There's a deliberate escalation in how the sex scenes are staged, both in terms of the physicality and the framing. And so, how did you think about shooting intimacy in a show like this, where the tone is kind of walking that line between discomfort and real honesty and also dark humor?
We spent a lot of time talking about the sex scenes because I think Steve was a little uncomfortable with it. I don't think he had directed a lot of sex scenes before. And they're always uncomfortable to shoot. You have intimacy coordinators to help everybody get comfortable with, the actors and the director blocking the scenes and communicating with each other and making sure it's very comfortable for everybody, but also helping the crew interact with those um, actors in those spaces, but also with the stand-ins who have to sometimes hold those poses for an hour while you're lighting them, or not usually an hour because we're pretty fast, but
Yeah,
20
but
minutes or
still,
something.
yeah,
Yeah. But yeah, we built that set based on a real location, and um, we actually had to shoot one scene at the real location, but most of that happened on stage. Most of the interior of that motel set happened on stage, and we talked to Laura Fox. Steve and I talked to Laura Fox quite a lot about wanting to shoot reflections, and she offered up, a lot of mirrored walls, and so
mm,
basically every wall has a mirror on it, so that we could create as many interesting compositions without having to necessarily show too much nudity if it wasn't actually working for the shot.
yeah,
We often tried to shoot against the windows, so looking toward the windows where you're backlit, and the shadow side is to camera, so you can play in silhouette. So you're not seeing too much open nakedness,
Yeah.
and it's more inferred. But yeah, then we would create a composition and a reflection that it was just so much fun and so beautiful to do. But that was super
Yeah.
fun. I mean, the big challenge for me was because Steve was, I think, uncomfortable about it in the beginning, and obviously as we got closer and closer to the dates of shooting that, he and Jason and Linda and Floyd were all having conversations about how they were going to do these things. So, the comfort level's growing till the
Yeah.
day you get there, and it's really not as bad on the day as you thought it was going to be. Right, all that anxiety. But we had Steve and I had some conversations about not being invasive to the set as much as possible during that time. So I actually came up with a plan to, we've got a sun source outside the window, which is a which is an Airy T24 lamp. It's a super bright tungsten light. And very last minute, I asked my gaffer Dan Cornwall and my key grip Kurt Cornerman to figure out a way to mount it on a telescoping crane that we usually use for a
Wow.
camera. So like a techno crane. So like a 50
Yeah.
foot techno crane. We created a yoke that would hold this huge light on it so that when, after we've rehearsed the scene and after we've put our base lighting inside the room, maybe just a little bit of fill, a couple lights through a piece of diffusion, that I then could be at my monitor while they're actually filming and change these levels of light without interrupting the scene. But this
Wow.
telescoping 24K outside the window, I literally could ask the operator to lower it down a couple of inches so that the flare gets to the lens. Or if Jason and Linda's heads are coming together and blocking it when they're actually doing a scene, we could raise it up just a couple millimeters and all of a sudden you get this flare back in there. And so it was actually happening live that we were able to create this emotion for them. And it was it was a real gift to be able to have, a production that would support that kind of idea, and a budget that would support that kind of idea, because it's not cheap either. But
Yeah.
really, the time saving was fantastic, and it just allowed these actors a lot of freedom.
So much effort for things that we probably don't notice straight up, but it's so subliminal. We're taking it all in. There's a moment in episode 2, by the way. This is the moment where I gasped, where Floyd steps on the highway, rescues that troubled guy, and that sun is setting behind them. And I just could not believe. I was just like, how on earth did you get that shot? It was perfect. Talk me through it.
Yeah, so that Steve called this Chicago Henge, right? So it's like Stonehenge, right?
Yeah.
Stonehenge has that one time a year where the sun perfectly goes through those stones, and it's an effect that happens in every city across the world at some point.
Yeah.
The time of year, the sun comes barreling down in between skyscrapers. So Chicago Henge was a reference that he talked about, and he wanted to be this really strong silhouetted situation. And it was a real challenge for us because we knew, that it was something we were not going to be able to shoot for real with a camera in the middle of traffic. The effort would have just been massive, and the coordination of cars, avoiding, and stunts and all of that happening. So we ended up doing this. It's actually quite a large visual effects shot.
Wow.
And that shot is actually done on stage in studio. And the solution was quite simple in the end. We took a T24, same light we just used in the motel. We put it up on a very tall stand above them, far, far away. And that was our sunlight that backlit these characters. We filled the stage full of smoke. And the reason why we wanted such a controlled lighting situation, because we could have done it outside or something like that. But what happens in the real life, right? With all those buildings, when the sun's that low, is they become shadow makers, right? They suck away all this light. So we really wanted a dark environment to start with. So you've got this beautiful backlight coming in. We've got a bunch of lights bounced into the ceilings and to the ceiling for just the right amount of ambience. But then we just let these, David's character and this boy sort of do their magic. And then our visual effects team beautifully laid in that bridge and all those cars and all those buildings.
My
It's
God.
fantastic work by them.
like you think as a viewer that you're super sophisticated and you know what's going on. I totally bought that. I thought it was so beautiful, so
Oh,
stunning,
that's
and it
great.
really. And I had to pause for a moment and just go, "Wow." Okay, so final question is: you've obviously mentioned that you've worked with Steve Conrad on a few projects now. What's specific about your shorthand with him that allows you and him to take risks like this, especially on a show that doesn't behave like a traditional murder mystery?
I think the big difference with working with Steve than I get with some other directors is he has ultimate trust in me. It's very unusual where I come to Steve with an idea and he rejects it. You know what I mean? He pushes back on it. He may correct me with the mood, you know, like a tonal difference, the way I interpreted a scene as we talk about it. But he really trusts me with the photography, and he's brilliant with the camera. Don't get me wrong, I'm not doing all this by myself, but it really comes from a real trust between each other. You know, that his intentions, I never have to worry about. My intentions, he never has to worry about. And I think that really is the big difference for us.
Mate, that's a dream. If you can get that kind of relationship on set,
It is.
you're killing it.
It is a dream.
Honestly, James,
Yeah.
there's a real precision to how the show's visual language observes people, and it makes the whole show feel so unsettling in the best way. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you for being on the show.
Amazing, Robert. Thank you so much for having me. This is great.